Okay, the question that Rav Moshe is dealing with in the 1950s is some brothers notice that their younger brother wants to sit and learn after he gets married. He's now a yeshiva bacher. They want him. I'm not sure if I know who the question is about, but the issue over here is they want their younger brother to be able to sit and learn in comfort, and they see that he's successful in his Torah studies, and they want to be able to start putting money away now from their tzedakah funds to the exclusion of other poor people, obviously, and to start putting money away so that by the time that he's ready to get married, they'll already have a nest egg for him. Is that permissible to do, even though it's at the expense of people right now who are needy, who could put those tzedakah funds to use? So he says, umemela, so this is where we're up to, umemela. So we established that a person an individual donor has the right to earmark his tzedakah to whatever fund, to whatever cause speaks to him, even if it doesn't fit into the prioritization system that is advocated by the Shulchan Aruch. And it's also permissible to give tzedakah to someone who has more than 200 zuz, because that's not going to be sufficient to be able to make a wedding. So based on all that, he writes, Umemela, Kevin Shuhu Rashai Lekabel, Rasha'in Ha'achin Lahafrish Tzedakah Shalahem Avur Zeh, Af Ata. He says, since it would be permitted for the brother to accept, since he doesn't have money, it would be permitted for the brothers to set aside tzedakah for him, even now, sha'adayin lo nasa, that he's not yet married and he's not yet even, hasn't even found a girl yet. Im lefi daitam tzrichim lahatchil le'esof ba'ad zeh mehayom. If they calculate that they need to start now in order to support their brother, let's say who'll get married in 3 years. But what they would have to do, and this is an interesting proviso that Rav Moshe says is necessary, they would have to actually transact that money over to their brother from now. It's not just enough to put it into a trust or a savings account, unless the trust, I guess maybe if the trust was, I'm sure there's a way to legally structure it where it becomes the property of their brother, even though he doesn't have access to it for a certain amount of time. He says the imlokain lo yatsu adayin b'mitzvah tzedakah, because if they just leave it in their account, then they haven't fulfilled the mitzvah of tzedakah with it. Vim ena ma'aminim lo sheyikayim hatanai leishiv b'lilmod. He says if they don't trust that the brother will use the money for sitting and learning in Kollel, they're not sure, they want to put aside the money for him, yitztarchu l'haniach bebank befund miyuchad. See Rav Moshe's interesting English, right? They'd have to put it in a bank in a special fund, al zeh kedei sheyetzei mirashusam tzachat tzedakah, so that the tzedakah funds leave their possession legally, shirak uz mekayim in mitzvah tzedakah, because in that way they would be fulfilling the mitzvah of tzedakah. So he says, v'hine, af shirashoim v'gam mitzvah aleim lahafish tzedakah mehayom abur achehem. He says, even though they're permitted, and it is a mitzvah for them to set aside tzedakah even from today for the sake of their brother, and we really should sort of like underline that little tiny paragraph, because Rav Moshe says it's permitted, and with one proviso, they have to set aside the fund so that it's no longer in their possession, and they should put it into a trust. So that the he says, even though they're permitted to set aside their tzedakah money for their brother, because that's to support him in his Torah study, because after all, that is a big mitzvah, but they should not spend all of their tzedakah money for that purpose, to absolve themselves from supporting other yeshivot. He says, first of all, I'll tell you what, you're not supposed to take all of your tzedakah to give to one person. She'isa b'siman reishin zayin siftes. He says, as the Shulchan Aruch itself says, you should try to distribute to multiple aniyim, because you can help more people. Ach al zeh yesh lefakfek shemashma miloshen hashach sifkat yutes tuhurak benosein la'ani echad rachok umeniach shar aniyim ola ani karov v'yesh od aniyim karovim. He says, but here's where there's room for deliberation, because the truth is, the Shach says that when the Shulchan Aruch says you're not supposed to just give to one poor person, it's talking about that one poor person is not your relative, and you're giving it exclusively to him at the expense of other non-related aniyim. Or you're giving to one relative when you have multiple relatives, right? That's not a great situation to be in when you have multiple relatives who rely on you for tzedakah. It's a big stress. It's very stressful. He says, "Because of sham la'ani echad bilvad o lekarav echad ulaniach shar krovim." He cites that from his language. V'chein isa b've'er hagola b'shem hamordechai mashma de'be'en lo od krovim aniyim yacholitin kol tzidkos of lani echad krov ulaniach harachokin. He says it sounds like from the Shach that what I just said you shouldn't do, you would be allowed to do, to give all your tzedakah to the one relative who needs it, even at the expense of other aniyim who are not related. The lagabi rechokim kishika karov lekalav klalchi of mitzvahs tzedakah lacherim kevin she'alfinun mikra tzedakah da'akarov kodem. And the argument being is that once we've established that a relative takes priority, you can absolve yourself from giving tzedakah to anybody else by just giving to that one relative. So perhaps you could set aside all of your tzedakah money. He says, "V'chein mash mektsas meha tana devei Eliyahu." I don't think that's the correct abbreviation. Shehevi hagra b'simin reish nalav sivkat and dalid. Sha'amar b'tchila yefarnes es aviv v'imo v'im hosu yefarnes es echa v'achyosav. He says, because the language there is, the Gra says, first, if your parents need support, you have to support them first. And then if you have leftover tzedakah funds, you should support your siblings. And then if you have leftover tzedakah money after that, you should give your remaining funds to other poor people who are not your relatives. It sounds like from that statement that it would be permitted to give all of your tzedakah money to a relative, even if you end up giving nothing to religious organizations. He says, avol. But, he says, my position is going to be somewhat different. He says, ha-mekor hadin v'lo yitin kol tzidkosov la'ani echad hu me'erevin dav samech gemel. He says, the source of this halacha, that you shouldn't give all of your tzedakah money to one person, comes from a Gemara in Erevin that says, the Amar Rabbi Abba Bar Zabda, kol hanosein matnosav l'kohen echad mevi ra'av la'olam. That anyone who gives all of his truma to only one kohen brings famine to the world. Shenemar ira haya kohen l'David shaya meshager lo matnosav. And the reason the Gemara cites a story from Sefer Shmuel, that there was a man whose name was Ira Haya'iri. He was a Kohen, and David used to give all of his truma to this man Ira. V'chasiv basrei vayihi ra'av k'di isa b'bahag. And then right afterwards in Sefer Shmuel, it says there was a famine. So the Gemara is correlating that, and it says that it was David's fault that the famine came because he did not distribute his wealth of his truma evenly. The ira haya'iri hayarabo shel od rab shu kohen ve'ein lechalek bein matnos kahuna. So he says, and ira was, the ira hayarabo shel David shu kodem af la'aviv. He says, and ira was David's rebbe, and we know that a rebbe takes priority even to a parent in many halachos. So a rebbe is like a relative, and still the Gemara is critical of David for having given his truma to someone who is like a relative to the exclusion of other people. Alma da afla rabba any yacholitin called matnosa bekol shekain la'ava b'krova. So we see from that Gemara, logic would dictate that even if you're giving all your money to a relative, that's not acceptable. V'lo matzinu shahaya leDavid od rab shehu kohen. We don't know of any other Rebbe that David had who was a Kohen. Ve'ein lechalek bein matnos kahuna litzdaka din kein minolan klal shegam b'tzdaka ikadin zeh. He says, and don't tell me that there's a difference in halacha between truma and tzedakah, because the whole source of the halacha that you're supposed to give your relatives first comes from the laws of truma. Elavadai shalom echalkinan bimkein gamkein lekarov ein litin kol tzidko. Or sorry, the whole halacha that you're not supposed to give just to one person comes from truma. He says, and therefore we don't make any distinction. Bimkein gam lekarov ein litin kol tzidkosav. He says, and therefore, even though the Shach says that you are allowed to give, it seems like he's saying you are allowed to give all your money to one relative, to the exclusion of non-related aniyim, but it seems like from the Gemara that that's not the case. I forget, it could be Tana D'Veliyahu, but I'm not sure. Nefare shahoser perusho yoser minasina chashuva uruya. Im lo ela kedei nasina chashuva echas yitain la'aviv. Im hoser minasina chashuva le'echad yitain la'echav. He says maybe what it means over there is not that you are giving all of your tzedakah money to one relative to the exclusion of everyone else, but it means you have, let's say, significant funds, but you can only afford to give to one ani a significant gift. All of the other ones you'll give a smaller gift to. That is probably what the Gemara, what that statement means in that text. It means that you give, you're supposed to give to your father first the significant gift, and leave over for your other aniyim non-significant gifts or lesser gifts. Below shehu yoter mitzarech ha'ani karovo ela da'afsha adayin yesh lekrovo tzarech im yesh lo yoter minitina chashuv le'echad yitain la'acher. So he says, and it doesn't mean that you should only give to your relative. It means that you should give the larger gift to your relative, but not to the absolute exclusion of everybody else. That's how Rav Moshe is learning. And so his argument is that when you are giving money to a relative, it should not be to the complete exclusion of all other aniyim. You have a right to set aside money in advance for your brother, put it in a segregated account that no one can touch until he's ready to get married and sit and learn. That's fine. But, and you can give the lion's share of your tzedakah to your brother, but you have to make sure that you also leave over some money for other non-relative charities. V'ulai meforish hashach sheRebbi Abba bar Zavda pligi el Rav Hamnuna Shamar La'el mizeh de'ira ha'yeiri ha'yerabo shel David. He says it could be that the Shach maybe holds that there's a machlokus in the Gemara on this topic, right? Masha Rebbe Hamnuna Amar Shahir Rabo Pirush Rashi Shumei Oso Ira Ha'iri Akol David Shemir Mefarishu Rav LeDavid. So he's giving a little bit of explanation in what the Gemara means, but in the body, at the end of the day, the imkain yesh lanu raya rak she'en litain kol matnosav la'ani rachok. And therefore, according to that other interpretation, it's only referring to a non-relative, that you should not give all of your tzedakah to only one poor person. See? Okay, we don't have to go through this whole explanation. He says, but even if you're going to learn like the Shach, that you do have a right to give all of your tzedakah money to your relative at the expense of all of the other aniyim in the community and all of the other charities in the community, he says you should still follow my advice and you should still leave over some money for other charities. Why? Because if you don't, you'll be making a chilul Hashem. What does he mean by that? Shebnei Adam lo yomru shenosing lekrova le yomru shein choshen mitzvahs tzedakah v'achzakas Torah. He says because your friends are going to call you a tightwad, and they're going to think that you don't fulfill the mitzvah of tzedakah. In other words, people don't realize Sometimes a person is asked to donate to a charity, and he says, "I'm sorry, I can't donate right now. I don't have the funds." And everyone knows that this guy has money, right? What they don't realize is that he's supporting his sister, who's a widow, and he's supporting his sister-in-law, who, or his brother-in-law from another side, and he's got a nephew with this and that, and it turns out that he's supporting 10 of his relatives, and almost like raising a completely different family, and he's got huge expenses for tzedakah, and they don't realize that, but it also brings embarrassment and casts aspersions on a person's reputation. So he says, you don't want that. He says, "V'gam yigramu shachem lo yitnu." And also, if you're a person of means in the community and you don't give to a cause, it's going to cause other people to not give. Lachein yasu shechelek hagodol yafrishu avor achayim. So therefore, the lion's share of your tzedakah can go to your brother, he says. V'chelek tzedakah yitnu l'shar hatzdakos v'hachzakos yeshivos. And then the remainder of your tzedakah funds should go to community causes and supporting yeshivas. And in that way, you'll fulfill the mitzvah properly and sanctify heaven. Yedido Moshe Feinstein. So that's our resolution. Our resolution is you certainly can give the bulk of your tzedakah to a relative. And that's true even if right now your relative doesn't need the money. But you know that down the road, they will need a large amount of money. Let's say I have a situation where I have, what if I have a grandson who I know his parents are not going to be able to send him to yeshiva. And I'm not obligated to send that boy to yeshiva. He's my grandson. It's not my responsibility. But I would hate to see my grandson go straight from high school, go off to university, or not do anything after high school. So I'm going to take it upon myself to send my grandson to yeshiva. The only thing is that if I wait until my grandson is old enough to go to yeshiva, I'll be retired and I'll be on a pension. And I won't have saved up sufficient money to be able to support the $30,000 that I'm going to need to send him to yeshiva. So I'm going to start putting money aside now. I'm going to take it from my tzedakah money, and I'll put it in a trust with his name on it, that he can't touch it until he's 20 years old or 18 years old, for the sake of going to yeshiva. Right? So that you have every right to do, but just don't make that your exclusive charity. You should give to other charities as well. That's Rav Moshe's maskana. Does that sound reasonable? Okay. Okay, very good. Let us go on with the halacha. So we had seen yesterday how did we get onto this issue? Because we were talking about Mihu Roy Litol Tzedakah. We started this halacha about who is worthy or who has a right to take tzedakah. We said that any person who doesn't have enough income to last them for the year qualifies as an ani, and not only can a private donor give that person tzedakah, but that person has a right to request from the community funds for a gift. So mishi yesh lo sikum kesef kedei lichot shana shlema eno nikra ani. He says if a person if a person has enough money in the bank to live off of it for a full year, he is not called an ani. And that's true even if he's not able to generate any income from this money, so that once he spends it, it's gone. Shir sikum hakesef kedei lichot shana shlema nimdad lefi hatzrachim haminimaliyim kefi shenahug. He says how much does a person need to live out a year? That's calculated It's based on local convention, what a person would need in that time and place in order to live out the year. Let me just open up the next PDF. Here we go. Shani Garbo, in the place where this person lives. Im ha'ani hayaragil biyoter mizeh, ayin mashakasavnu le'el b'simin yud sif beis. If this person says, well, no, I need more than that. Like you're telling me that the minimal amount I would need to live, let's say in a city like Toronto for myself and my wife is, let's say, $50,000. That's the absolute minimum that I would need just to get by for a year. But I would need more than that because my standard of living is higher than that. So he says, see what we wrote before for people who are subjectively poor because they base it on what their previous standard of living was. And so we saw before, what did we say? We said, let's go back to Sif Beis, he says, if a person was used to a standard of living based on how he grew up, and that was more than what the average person would be able to subsist with in order to get by. Like when he was in a wealthy house in his upbringing, he used to ride on a horse, and he used to have a runner servant that would run ahead of him, right? Just like the good old days, right? The nasa, or he used to drive a certain kind of car. The nasa ani, kodim lo sus ve'eved mikiven shuhu bishvilo begeder de machzara. Then that counts as tzedakah, and you'd be permitted to, and the community should do whatever efforts they have, if they have the resources, to purchase this person a horse in order to be able to restore his standard of living, which is a little bit of a bitter pill to swallow. You know, here you have some people who are barely getting by, eking out a living without taking a penny from charity. And this guy says, oh no, I need tzedakah because I have to make payments on my Lexus or my Mercedes. And that's what I'm used to, you know, so you have to support my standard of living. Not so simple, but that's actually the halach. If a person can demonstrate that that's the way he was used to living, then we have to try our best to keep him at that standard. Okay, next halacha. That's right, exactly. Yeah, I'm not sure how to balance those two. We would tell a person you have to sell off those items. Yeah, I mean, it is a bit of a contradiction, right? Because you raise an excellent point, Lloyd. If we just learned that you have to sell off your more expensive items, so how do you reconcile that? I guess you'd have to argue that when we say you have to sell off all of your luxury items, that's when you're not where you haven't demonstrated a pattern of living according to a certain standard. Let's say you recently came into a huge successful deal and you bought yourself all of these items just 6 months ago, and then all of a sudden the market crashes and you discover that you're now you're not worth a penny. So you can't go to the tzedakah, to the community fund, until you sell off all of your assets. So it's a bit of a different situation. But what we're talking about is a person who was used to his whole life having a certain standard of living, that we don't require you to sell off. We try to support you in any way that we can to maintain your dignity. Because it's truly humiliating to have to go from a place of living luxuriously to a place of living with abject poverty. Okay. Let's say a person earns a monthly salary that suffices to support him and all of the members of his family. So even though he doesn't have any money in the bank, which is quite often the case, in other words, some people live paycheck to paycheck. That's what they call it, right? Um, that's not called an ani. Eino nikra ani. He's not called an ani. Afilu im ein lo sikum kesef kedei lichot shana shalema. Even though he doesn't have sufficient funds in the bank to live off of his savings for a year. V'im yesh lo maskoret kavua aval eina maspika b'chol tzarchei beis, nikra ani. But what if a person has a monthly salary, and I know people like this, but it's not enough to cover their basic needs once you take tuition into account? So then that person qualifies as an ani. And he's allowed to take tuition reductions and scholarships and also take Tomchei Shabbos if they need it. I know plenty of people who are on a fixed income, but they still qualify as aniyim because they don't have enough with their fixed income to be able to cover all of their expenses. And those are the kinds of people who we regularly support with our tzedakah fund. In other words, people who are members of our kehillah here in Thornhill, who have fixed either pensions or what is it called? OSP? What is that? Ontario Disability. And so they're able to get by with their basics, but before Rosh Hashanah or before Pesach, they need a little bit extra just so that they can have Yantif, So those are the people primarily who we support, are the people who just need a little bit more to get by before the Chagim. And so we want them to have at least, some feeling of dignity that when they go to the market, they don't have to just buy the bare minimum that they need for Yantif, that they have so that they feel that they can maybe buy a cake or have something nice, something special for the Chag. And so that's what our fund is for. Ma'amad shel ani mishtane lefi hatzrachim. The next thing he writes is that the halachic status of an ani changes all the time based on need. Ledugma, mishi yesh lo sikum kesef kedei lichot shana shlema bechavod, afilu shelo nikra ani. So he says, let me give you an example. Someone has enough money to live in their savings to live for a full year in a dignified way. So he doesn't qualify as an ani. Mikol makom kishemagia l'sheilat hadira kishu muchrach liknot. But let's say he needs to buy a place to live. So kegon be'eretz Yisrael she'ein efsharut liskor ela biyoker ma'od. Like in Israel, where renting is far more expensive than purchasing, and that's not necessarily the case anymore. From what I'm told, it's actually less expensive to rent today in Israel than it is to buy. This perhaps is especially in places like Tel Aviv, right, where the property prices have skyrocketed. Sometimes rentals are cheaper, but let's take his let's work with his assumption. Shita de le'inyan hadira al kol panim hu begeder ani umutilo lekabel tzedakah b'shvil kiniyat hadira. Then he does qualify as an ani as far as purchasing an apartment. And this is he brings this from Rav Moshe in Siman Kuf Mem Dalid. And I think I would want to maybe look at that for next time, just because it's not so simple to me that the people who come from Eretz Yisrael and want to raise money to buy an apartment for their children who are getting married, whether that really is certainly, well, you could say, well, they could rent for a few years until they make enough money, until they put away enough money to be able to afford to buy a dirah. Why is it that just because the convention in Eretz Yisrael is to purchase for a chassan and kala a new dirah, that we in the Jewish community in the diaspora should have to support that if that's not our convention? A lot of our kids can't afford to buy their own place when they get married. Probably most kids can't afford to buy their own place. And you and I don't go around asking for tzedakah in order to be able to buy our children an apartment. yes, it's true. That seems to be the convention in certain communities in Eretz Yisrael. But should we have to assume that convention in Chutz La'aretz in order to be able to support that way of life? He's saying that a person does have a right to ask for tzedakah in that situation. I'd want to take a look at the source for this. And I also would want to question whether anyone should feel, and in other words, it's one thing to justify a person being allowed to ask for tzedakah, but does that mean that the donor, the private donor, or that the community chest who gives out charity should feel a responsibility to give? So I will tell you that what we generally do is at any time, stop it here, anytime a person comes to our Gabbai at the 645 million, we have a checkbook and we give out checks for $18 to anyone who asks, which is a small amount of money. And that's why we do it. But we wouldn't be giving out much larger gifts than that unless the person was local and was able to demonstrate need. Okay, well,